Thank you so much for joining us for the Tevis Jacobs Lab webinar on the Worldwide Surface Topography Challenge. My name is Tevis Jacobs. I'm a professor here at the University of Pittsburgh and also the president of Surface Design Solutions. I'm here with Dr. Arushi Pradhan, formerly a PhD student in my group, but recently graduated. We're going to be talking about some work that was done in collaboration with Martin Muser from Saarland University and Lars Pastevka from the University of Freiburg. Let's dive right in. So our goal, the motivating goal of this whole work and my research and my work in general is how do we improve surface performance by optimizing surface topography? And I want to motivate what a hard problem this is by looking to the bone tissue engineering field within biomechanics. There was a great review about 12 years ago, and they looked at a simple question: how do we get cells to adhere to bone scaffolds, to metal scaffolds? And they looked at the literature. They found some papers that said that a rougher surface will be less adherent and a smoother surface will be more adherent. They found other papers that showed exactly the opposite. If you roughen up the metal, then the shear strength of the cells increases. In the end, the authors gave up. They came to this conclusion: overall, the effect of surface roughness is inconclusive due to contradicting data in the literature. So the motivation for this study is that there's got to be a better way. If we're going to be able to control surface properties, we need better ways to measure and analyze surface topography. Now, the problem, as many of you will know, is that topography is multi-scale. Right? So take an electric vehicle, different parts of the car, you care about different things when you talk about surface performance, maybe worried about friction, adhesion, wear, but also electrical conductivity, haptics and how it feels, visual appearance and how it looks, sealing and leakage, etc. And all of these depend on different length scales of topography. So if you think of topography as, bumps on top of larger bumps on top of larger bumps, right? Different scales control different aspects of performance. And so inherently, all the attempts to use a single number to describe roughness are going to fail because what works in one context can't possibly work in another context. So what we did back in 2022, we launched the Surface Topography Challenge. It was a challenge to, we call it the tribology community, but it was broader than that. It was anyone who is focused on surfaces. And the idea is that we would send out samples and anyone who wanted could measure those and send them back. We'll have more details in a minute. But the objectives of this challenge were to, one, assess advantages and disadvantages of different surface measurement techniques. Two, create the world's most comprehensive description of a surface yet created. And three, aid in the development of going beyond those single number roughness descriptors and getting next generation descriptors that we can all use to predict performance. Now, we published the Surface Topography Challenge, the problem definition. It can be downloaded using the link on the bottom. So a little bit about the logistics. What did we do? We created surfaces, hundreds of surfaces that were nominally identical. The way we did that was using techniques from the semiconductor manufacturing industry. We created a big wafer of a chromium nitride coating. That's a common coating used for wear resistance and corrosion and oxidation resistance. We deposited it on all the wafers together, so a single batch, nice uniform coating. And then we cut the wafers into pieces, as shown here, and numbered each of the pieces. We wanted to create two surfaces instead of just one. So we have what we call the smoother surface. Well, that's just a prime grade silicon wafer with a chrome nitride deposited on it. And then we also have the intentionally rougher surface. Same chromium nitride coating, but this time deposited on the unpolished backside of the wafer after reactive ion etch was applied. Now, at this point, we have hundreds of samples. We sent them out. This is a little plastic wafer box with a small 1 centimeter square sample. Each one is numbered on the reverse with a unique identifier. And we sent these to anyone who would sign up. The idea, all you had to do to participate in this challenge is to measure topography however you normally would. So we sent it to manufacturers, we sent it to scientists, we sent it to researchers, and they were free to use stylus profilometry, optical techniques, atomic force microscopy, whatever of the many, many measurements there are out there they wish to use. All right, so that's the question of what we did and why. Now I'm going to turn it over to Arushi, who's going to talk a little bit about what we found.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. So initially what we had thought was, okay, maybe we'll get a few participants. However, we got an overwhelming contribution from 153 people from all over the world. We had participation from every single continent except Antarctica. And we're incredibly grateful to everyone who contributed to the challenge. So from this, we were able to measure submissions from over 12 different techniques, broadly categorized into three. The first one is microscope-based techniques, and these include any technique where you have a source of light or electron and you're taking a top-down image. So the first site would be confocal laser scanning microscopy. So on the left, you see the rougher surface, which has features as we saw on the SEM image as well, of small plateaus that are also due to the RIE edge, and these features are as intended. Now, the smoother surface looks a little bit smooth at this scale, and this is also as expected. We can zoom in a little bit further, use something like white light interferometry, and now we're at the 20 micron scale over here, and we see some of these features repeated. It's like we zoom in on a little area. We can also have other microscope-based techniques, such as holographic microscopy. We can have digital 3D microscopy or focus variation, and also something like SEM reconstruction, which might be new to a few people. So here you use different sources of backscatter electrons, and you combine the images digitally to create the topography from SEM. The other type of techniques are contact-based, where you are scanning a probe across the surface, either near contact or actually in contact. And these techniques are differentiated by the size of the probe. The first one people will be familiar with is stylus profilometry or tactile microscopy. On the left, we have the rougher surface. Again, we see the features that we expect at the 300 micron scale. We also have the smoother surface. The Z scale here is a lot different simply because the surfaces are so different at this scale. However, the X scale is the same for both. We also have something like nano indenter, which is like a stylus. However, the probe is just a little bit smaller, and you can scan the probe across the surface. You can also have something like atomic force microscopy. So here your probe is on the size of 20 to 40 nanometers, and you're scanning a portion of the features you're seeing over here. So at 5 microns, this is what we expect. On the smoother surface, we can also see that now we're starting to see features of the chrome nitride crystals. But we can zoom in a little bit further, and we can see these features of chrome nitride really show on both the rougher and the smoother surface. Now you might be saying, did you just copy paste the same image? Well, no, not really. So these surfaces were both chrome nitride coatings deposited at the same time on two different types of wafers, but in the same batch processing, which means the small scale features should be the same as we see on the AFM. This also allows us a good check of are we measuring the correct topography, right? So the next type of techniques that we classified was cross-section based techniques. So these include something like an SEM image that you can take from the cross-section view of the sample. And here you have an image, and you can extract a line profile by picking points along this edge, which gives us the 1D line profile as we saw on the stylus profilometer. So here we can see at this small scan length of 200 nanometers, for both rougher and smoother surface, now the Z height is similar, and they show the same topography at the small scale. We can go even further with something like transmission electron microscopy. And I'll zoom in over here to show you an image. You can even see the atomistic contribution to roughness here, and we can extract a line profile, as I said. Okay. And the first question people ask is, okay, so you have all of these measurements. I think total it was around 2088. How did you consolidate all of these? They're probably all different file types. How did you ask people to submit? Well, we used a web application developed by Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Prestevka, called contact.engineering. So here you can create a digital surface twin where you can have measurements from different types, such as stylus, AFM, TEM, and you can upload it all onto this free web application here. You can also perform various surface analytics if you want, such as RQ, spectral analysis, or autocorrelation functions. And what it's best for is also to share and publish. So participants were simply able to upload their data set and hit share, and we were able to access this. So a lot of the surfaces that we showed here today are already published on contact.engineering. So feel free to go to the website, and you'll be able to see the participants' submissions as well. Okay. So now we talked about the submissions process. Let's talk about results. So there are a lot of different ways to analyze roughness, which is also the motivator behind this challenge. The metric that we used was the root mean square height. Now the root mean square height is the statistical measure of roughness, which quantifies the amplitude of the surface height. So you simply take the square root of the average deviation from this mean line over here, and we can get a value of arm's height. Here it's an example is shown. This is 3.2 microns. So the lower the value, it indicates smoother the surface. So we do this for all 2088 measurements. For the rougher surface and smoother surface, whoa, you see a variation from 10 microns to 100 picometers. How do we go that wrong, right? Well, we're not actually wrong. Well, what the expert will already know is that surface topography metrics are meaningless without specifying the scale. So if we look at the rougher surface and the smoother surface, at the large scale, we see different features versus at the lower scale of, let's say, AFM, we see different features. So the bumps on top of bumps on top of bumps. So if we look at arm's height over scan length, then we start to see that we're not quite as bad as we thought we were. The variation is explained by scan length. Now, there's a lot on this plot, so pausing to talk about the legend a little bit. So all microscope-based techniques are in the reddish colors and are open-shaped. Contact-based techniques are blue, and they're filled with colors. Cross-section based techniques are your line shapes, and they are green in color. Here we can see that for different instruments, they are able to perform roughness measurements at different scan lengths. And some of this variation is explained, however, even within a technique, for example, this AFM measurement here, we can still see variation from 100 nanometers to 1 nanometer. So talking about that a little bit, let's look at just one type of technique, the side view SEM for the rocker surface. On the right, you can see an image of what that looks like. And you have different submissions all the way from less than a micron to more than 100 micrometers. So here we see a large variation. These variations are just expected when you do a round robin test with a lot of different groups. So what we did was instead of applying a subjective criterion where we looked at each image and said, okay, this is good versus this is bad, we created log space bins to identify the middle 50% of the data. Inevitably, some of the points overlapped on a bin, and if that happened, we simply shifted it to reduce the overlap. And here we can create these box plots where we specify the median and the 25%, 75%, or the interquartile range. And we identify the data that was beyond this 50%, also shown in gold over here. And so we remove these extreme values due to expected variations, and now we get a much clearer picture of roughness at each scan. Now, sometimes we didn't have enough measurements per bin, and that's indicated by these black colored shapes over here. So we repeat this for all of our data as shown before. So on the left, we have rougher surface. On the right, we have the smoother surface. Let's see what happens. So data beyond interquartile range can be removed by using the method that we showed before, which helps us establish consensus within the technique. However, as I switch from before to after, something you can see is that while we got rid of the variation, there's still discrepancies between techniques. For example, here we have SEM reconstruction showing a lot higher than the rest of the techniques. Or even clearer in the smoother surface, the white light interferometer shows a lot of variation with the other techniques at the same scale. So moving from the RMS height, which gives us a single value or a scalar metric, we can also represent roughness in terms of the power spectral density, which is simply the square of the Fourier transform. And what that really means is if you have a hypothetical surface, as shown over here, where you have a large wavelength of sinusoid and you have superimposed on this smaller wavelengths, what you can do is take the Fourier transform and shift to the frequency domain. So when you do that, you will find peaks at the contributing wavelength. So here, this is low Q or high wavelength. So this large wavelength, this is peak here. And this is high Q or low wavelength, which is the smaller wavelengths shown over here. So when we do that, of course, for our actual surface over here, where we have several wavelengths, then we can see that you get a spectrum instead of these sharp spikes here. So the way to look at this power spectral density, if you're new to it, is on the x-axis, you can think of this as the contribution to topography. And on the y-axis, you can think of this as a lateral length scale or wave vector. And so we can do this for a single measurement. So this is one single measurement. Instead of one value metric, we have a full spectra defining the roughness characteristics. This is for the rougher surface, and this is for the smoother surface. As I said, on the X, you have contribution to topography. On the Y, you have your lateral length scale. Wave vector, we all tend to think in terms of wavelengths. So on the top, you can see that we also have the wavelength represented here, millimeters to nanometers. So on the right, you have smaller scale features. On the left, you have larger scale features. Now let's do this for all of our measurements. So it's still showing a big mess, right? Even after the corrections we applied from RMS height. And we see a lot of these cutoffs over here where your data is suddenly dipping. So the cause of this is actually resolution. So all of our techniques that we're using have some sort of resolution limits. Microscope-based techniques, for example, is due to diffraction limits of using wavelength. So for example, if you have your surface here and you have a wavelength of light, then that limits the features that you will be able to measure correctly. And you tend to get something like this where you have altered topography features or where the instrument itself is interpolating between two peaks. And you can also have contact-based techniques show resolution effects. For example, this is a sharp AFM tip. As you can see, if you're scanning this surface over here, you'll be able to see precise topography as shown over here. But let's say during your scanning, something happened. You have a blunt AFM tip, so you were doing quite well at the start, but towards the end, it's like you took off your glasses, you start seeing a blunt tip scan over the same features, which blurs your topography image. And on the right, if we look at the topography versus wave vector, and this dashed line is your actual topography, you can correct for resolution using the power spectral density. This is your actual measurement, which is the black line. And you can see that there is a deviation from the actual measurements. So this is defined as a reliability cutoff, and you were able to identify that and remove this unreliable data. The entire process is explained in this paper called Quantitative Characterization of Surface Topography Using Spectral Analysis. Okay, now let's do this for our entire data set. So this is the PSD versus wave vector for the reference surface. And on the right, we asked participants to report the resolution. And based on this lateral resolution or the tip size, we were able to correct for these artifacts. For example, for the contact-based techniques, we identify the unreliable data, we remove that. If unspecified, we also applied a correction with average values of tip size. So when we do this, also for the microscope-based techniques and the cross-section based techniques, what we can see is that we have corrected for a lot of the variation. We can do the same for the smoother surface. So this is the PSD without any resolution correction. And this is the PSD where the unreliable data beyond resolution limit is removed. So if you can see the before versus the after, we can see that we corrected for a lot of discrepancies between techniques using reliability cutoff. All right, now I talked to you a lot about results analysis. So how do we interpret these results? So Dr. Jacobs, take it away.
All right, so remember that one of the objectives was to establish the true topography of these surfaces and to try to figure out what it actually looks like. Now, as Arushi talked about, two steps there. One of them was removing the outer, top 25%, bottom 25% of individual submissions from a technique. The second was resolution cutoffs. And as Arushi mentioned, that got us a long way towards a single agreement. But you can see that there's still variability, both in terms of the power spectral density, there's a lot of difference, and then also in terms of the root mean square height. Now, what we didn't want to be doing is calling balls and strikes and saying, this measurement was good and this measurement was bad. So we simply tried to come up with an objective criteria for establishing what we call the consensus topography. So what we did is whenever there was a technique that deviated from the established consensus of at least two other techniques, we sort of used a majority rules approach. And so in this particular case, white light interferometry is colored in pink. And you can see that we removed that from the smoother surface because many of the measurements did not agree. Now, quick note here, I am not saying white light interferometry is not a useful technique. I use it significantly myself. We are not trying to make any larger claims about which techniques are, the best or the worst. And of course, you can see that many of the measurements performed with this technique were quite in line with the consensus. And yet, we didn't want to be saying, okay, well, these ones agree and these ones don't agree. And so we did make the final decision that based on the submissions we got, to just eliminate the entire technique from consideration. So for the smoother surface, this included white light interferometry. It included digital 3D optical microscopy. It included holographic microscopy. And then finally, confocal laser microscopy. Once we eliminated those, you can see that the variation along the y-axis, whether we look at PSD or whether we look at RMS height, has come down significantly. So finally, with all of those removed, now we can run those same analyses. We can look at the median of the surface topography. We can look at the upper and lower quartile, and we can see that we're honing in on a very specific consensus topography. Now, for the rougher surface, it was different surfaces or different measurement techniques that needed to be removed. One was SEM reconstruction. Another was holographic microscopy, and finally, digital 3D optical microscopy. Remember that some of those agreed with the consensus and some didn't, but just to be fair and impartial, we removed all of the measurements from a specific technique. Well, you can see, once again, with the rougher surface, we have now eliminated the chief sources of the variation, and we get a very accurate multi-scale characterization of this surface. So one of the things that I'm excited about with this challenge, that all these people came together and measured, is that we have established the complete topography of these surfaces. So a standard way to measure them, you get a single number such as average roughness RA or RMS roughness RQ, one single number. Well, here you can see that we have a broad-based consensus that describes this across all length scales. Okay, so we did all this work, we involved all these people. What are the lessons that we learned by doing so, and what are the important takeaways? First, if it matters, never rely on a single technique. Let me give you an example. Group A performed two different measurements on the samples they received. One of them was using a stylus profilometer. They got a root mean square height of 1.02 microns. Here's the image. On the same sample, they measured with a confocal microscope system and got, in this case, exactly the same. There could have been a little variation, but the same root mean square roughness and an image. This is a 2D image, a 2D scan, area scan, but of course they are at least commensurate. Now they got a little more sophisticated. We can plot their data along a power spectral density. And sure, there's some artifacts at the end that could be eliminated, but the point is that the two techniques agreed throughout the majority of length scales. Now look, we're showing the consensus topography in gray from the prior slide. Group A couldn't have known. We didn't release the results to the participants until it was over, so they couldn't have known that their measurements agreed with the consensus. But they used two completely different techniques, and they agreed. That's a good indicator that something is going well. Now let's contrast that with Group B. They made two measurements. They used exactly the same techniques. First, they used a stylus profilometer, got 0.94 microns for the root mean square height. Then they used confocal microscopy and got about 4.5 microns as the root mean square height. Now, if you plot these on a power spectral density, not only does the HRMS value differ, but the entire curve is very, very different. And you can see this is on a log scale. They're separated by about a decade. So look, Group B could not have known which of these measurements agreed with consensus, but they would have had an indication that one of them was having a problem. Again, they couldn't know which, but maybe they would look hard for artifacts in both of them. Maybe they would bring in a third technique to break the tie, etc. But the point is that while we can't all do thousands of measurements, round robin, hundreds of participants, that's not reasonable. What we can do is make measurements with multiple techniques and at multiple size scales. So we distilled these lessons down into what we call topography best practices. And topography best practice one is combine multiple types of measurements of the same surface. Okay, lesson two. Lesson two is a little subtle. Techniques need to be corrected for resolution limits. So even within one measurement, there will be portions of that measurement that are accurate and portions of that measurement that are inaccurate. Now, instead of throwing out the entire measurement because part of it is artifacted, if we do plot it in a scale-dependent way, like the power spectral density, then we can correct for those artifacts. We can use the diffraction limit in this case, or we can use an estimate of the tip radius in this case. There are more quantitative ways to do it, but these are very simple ways of saying, okay, I trust the data at larger sizes. I don't trust the data at smaller sizes. And by plotting it in this scale-dependent way, we can literally, put red X's over the material we don't trust, or even just cut it off in order to get a consensus answer. Even the cross-section based techniques, because it's a one-to-one resolution in height and lateral resolution, you can see that there were some issues, especially in the larger sizes. So topography best practice number 2. We recommend that you compute and report scale-dependent parameters. If you're comfortable with a power spectral density, that's ideal. If you're not comfortable with a power spectral density, at least scale-dependent scalar parameters, where you can say the value was 2 microns when measured at this size. And when I measured at a different size, I got a different value. Lesson 3 is maybe the most important one, at least for the average user. A single number can never describe a surface. Imagine if I asked you, well, hey, what's the roughness of this rougher surface? Well, one person could tell me 100 picometers. One person could tell me 20 microns, right? 6 orders of magnitude of variation, all for the same surface. So we really need to get out of the habit of specking a single number and claiming that describes the surface. Far better is to understand that the answer you get depends on the size at which you measure. So, you ask me the same question. Hey, how rough was that rougher surface? And I tell you, well, when I measured at 1 microns, I got an answer of about 5 nanometers in height. When I measured at 100 microns, I got a height of about 1 micron, right? And so, yes, orders of magnitude variation, except now that orders of magnitude variation makes sense. And we can go a step further. We can relate it back to how we initiated the motivation for this challenge, which is that there is no right scale for roughness. The size at which you measure needs to match the size at which your properties depend. And so both of those answers that I gave, 1 micron of roughness and 5 nanometers of roughness, both are accurate and both will be relevant in different cases. As a quick example, the quote-unquote rougher surface and the quote-unquote smoother surface might behave very differently in terms of haptics if you dragged your finger across them. They might behave virtually the same in an application that depends on the true contact area between them. So the topography best practice here is to save, analyze, and report the raw topography measurements. So share them with your colleagues. Even if someone asks you what the roughness is, you point them to a curve like this, rather than just saying the roughness is 5 nanometers. Okay, so with that, we're going to conclude. This has been an exciting multi-year project in collaboration with all of these folks. We encourage you to get in touch. We can be reached at surface-topography-challenge@gmail.com. Again, surface-topography-challenge@gmail.com. The key conclusions: 1, 153 people came together to measure nominally identical samples and all together to write this giant paper describing results. So I've never had an et al. That was quite so big, but Arushi is the lead author, and there are 152 authors behind her. And this is recently published in Tribology Letters. We'll post a link down below. Second, We analyzed data among the 153 people, first to reach consensus, and most importantly, to describe the representative topography. So we took it from, a big mess of 6 orders of magnitude down to a single coherent description. Finally, all together, these 153 people have distilled the lessons down and suggested 3 topography best practices, which are summarized here, and were summarized on the prior slides. And of course, more details can be found in the paper. I encourage you to do 2 things. One, to access all of the raw data. There are links in the paper. All of it is freely available. We hope that this is not the end of this project, but just the beginning, that people will continue to use the data that we've put out there and also continue to request these samples as a benchmark. Um, and you can, in general, learn about the challenge. You can also request samples. Of course, the challenge itself is over, the paper is published, but you can still get them as a benchmark surface, as I mentioned. You just have to go to http://contact.engineering/challenge. Again, contact.engineering/challenge. There's also a link to the paper there, just to make it easier. Okay, a few acknowledgements. This work was funded by the National Science Foundation, also the DFG, the German National Science Foundation, and the European Research Council. This was a collaboration between the University of Pittsburgh, University of Saarland, and University of Freiburg. IBC Materials helped us with the material deposition. Dr. Nate Miller, a former postdoc in my group, helped with the initiation of the challenge. And of course, huge thank you to you, all of the participants, and all of the institutions that they represent. So with that, I'm going to end with the conclusions, and I encourage you to reach out with any questions using the email that's shown there. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.